Thank you for joining me on this cold Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? I think so. Anyway, I apologize about the length of yesterday's video. I had a lot to say, and believe me, it could have been longer. There was even things I wanted to say that I thought of later, and I thought, no, it's long enough. I'm not gonna go add anything. I'm so sorry. I'm at In-N-Out Burger, so I've had some Dr. Pepper, and it makes me burp a lot. I know I need to quit that, but they went and made it delicious, so what am I supposed to do? Okay, so today I'm going to talk about objections to what I said in the previous video, and then objections to objective morality altogether. And since yesterday, doing that outline really helped a lot. I mean, I think I did a lot less stuttering and change and losing my train of thought and all that kind of stuff yesterday. I decided to make myself another outline, but this one's like half the length of yesterday, so don't worry. I don't think today's video is going to be quite as long as yesterday's video was. So one of the most frequent things that people say as a way of arguing against objective morality is just the observation that people have lots of differences in morality. And this, it's true within a culture, but it's also true from culture to culture. People have all kinds of differences in morality. Well, this is not a good objection for a few reasons. One reason is because it's not necessary that people have universal agreement on something before something could be objectively true. I mean, by the very nature of what it means to be objectively true, it doesn't matter whether people agree with it or not. And there was a time when, some people thought the earth was round and some people thought the earth was flat. But that mere disagreement didn't mean that the earth had no shape. Obviously, the earth had a shape. So whether people agree or disagree on morality is irrelevant to the question of whether there are objective morals. And even people that disagree on the particulars of morals still often agree that there is a moral. That's why they debate them, so they can straighten each other out on what actually is a moral. They both are presupposing an objective standard. But some people will say, will agree that differences in moral opinions don't show that there's no objective answer, but what they do show is that nobody knows the objective answer. Well, that doesn't follow either. I mean, the fact that people disagree on stuff doesn't mean that nobody knows the answer. And besides that, I think these differences are overblown. For one thing, if you have a conversation with somebody that has a different moral point of view than you do on some particular subject, all you have to do is ask them, why do you believe that? And you tell them why you believe that. Usually what you find out is that if somebody believes such and such moral principle or whatever, the reason is some broader moral principle. Like, for example, I think it's wrong to punch somebody in the nose. I might argue like this: it's wrong to do something that harms somebody needlessly. Punching somebody in the nose harms somebody needlessly, therefore it's wrong to punch somebody in the nose. So a lot of the moral positions we hold are morals that we inferred from prior moral principles. And the reason people have differences is sometimes due to the facts informing the case. Sometimes it's due to a difference in the reasoning process or whatever. But if you just ask somebody, why do you believe such and such, and you just keep on asking, eventually you come to some like foundational item of moral knowledge, some principle, some overriding principle or whatever, and you'll find that you agree with them often. And the disagreement comes with whether this particular action violates that principle. So you may agree on the principle, but just disagree on whether such and such behavior violates that principle. Another reason people have disagreements is because sometimes moral decision making is just difficult. You'll have a moral dilemma in which you have to choose the lesser of two evils or the greater of two goods. And the difference, two people can both agree that such and such principle is true and such other principle is true, but where they disagree is on which one is more important and stuff. And that will determine how they solve moral dilemmas. So one of them will solve the moral dilemma by proposing such and such moral imperative, and the other will come up with the opposite. So there really is no underlying difference in their moral awareness or whatever. Another reason people differ on morality is because we have this tendency morality is sometimes inconvenient. We want to behave in certain ways that aren't right for us to behave, so we make rationalizations, we make excuses, and we try to persuade ourselves that what we want to do is not really wrong after all. So we can delude ourselves. I wrote a blog post about deluding ourselves one time. There's also an article by Jay Budziszewski called The Revenge of Conscience that talks about this a lot, about how people know the good they ought to do, but they don't want to know it, and so they suppress this knowledge. And so I'm going to leave a link to that article. Another mistake I think people make is that they confuse behavior with moral principle. They just assume that the way people behave is a perfect indicator of the morals they subscribe to. Well, that isn't the case, because sometimes people can some people can believe that something is wrong and just not care. Sometimes the fact that something is wrong is what motivates people to do it. We have this rebellious spirit in us that just wants to buck the system. And so sometimes if something is wrong, or somebody tells us we can't do something, that's precisely what makes us want to do it. So you can't necessarily look at behavior to determine what somebody's moral point of view is. C.S. Lewis wrote in the back of one of his books, I don't remember which one it was, it may have been The Abolition of Man, that really cultures agree on morality far more than they disagree. And he gave examples like, you probably couldn't find a country in which everybody thought that the most moral thing to do is to stab everybody in the back who had been most kind to you. Things like that. I mean, we don't necessarily notice the similarities as much as we notice the differences, because the similarities just kind of happen automatically. We behave in certain ways automatically without even thinking about it. And so there's just this common sense of decency that exists cross-culturally that we don't really notice. But I really think it's true that people agree on morality far more than they disagree. All right, going on to the next objection. This one has to do with epistemology. Some people will say that you can't know any moral truths because moral truths are not empirical things, and you can only know things through your senses. Well, I addressed that in my whole series on epistemology. If you could only know things through your senses, well, then you couldn't know that your senses give you true information about a real external world, because that's not something your senses tell you. You couldn't know that your memories correspond to a real past. You couldn't know the uniformity of nature. I mean, I gave the whole list of things that you couldn't know if empiricism was the only way you could know them. Some people will point out that intuition is just notoriously unreliable. Usually when people make this objection, they're using intuition differently than it's used in philosophical circles. Usually in their case, they take intuition to be like a hunch or something like that. But that's not what it means. Intuition in this case just means knowledge that's written on our minds. And if you couldn't know anything that way, well, again, you couldn't know that the external world exists. You couldn't know that there was a past. You couldn't know that there were other minds, etc., etc. It turns out that a lot of the objections people bring up against morality, if you took those objections seriously, they would undermine all kinds of other things we take for granted, the existence of the external world, all those things. I mean, that's one of the advantages of the argument I gave in the last video by lumping morality, our knowledge of morality, in with our knowledge of all these other synthetic a priori truths. Most of the arguments, a lot of the arguments people bring against morality would apply equally to all those other things. And so if it's rational to believe those things in spite of those objections, then it's also rational to believe in morality in spite of those objections. Remember in yesterday's video I talked about how, there are a bunch of different moral theories, and they're not necessarily in conflict because they're trying to address different questions. Some of them try to address the question of whether there are objective morals or not. Some of them try to address the question of what we mean by our moral statements. Others try to address the question of how do we, in practice, make moral decisions in specific circumstances. And these moral theories include things like egoism, utilitarianism, divine command theory, all these different theories. And what they all try to do, or what most of them try to do, is come up with some moral principle, like Kant's categorical imperative, and they try to reduce all morality to that one principle. And so if something violates that principle, then it's wrong. If it doesn't violate that principle, then it's okay. That kind of thing. And so how do we usually judge these moral systems? Well, none of these moral systems would have gotten a foothold if they didn't give us mostly correct answers. But it's kind of like Newton's law of gravity. Newton's law of gravity works in most cases and stuff, so it seems like it's a correct description of reality. But then you get to really extreme cases when things are moving really fast, or they're in a really strong gravitational field or something. We start finding out that Newton's laws don't necessarily apply. And so then we get general relativity. And general relativity is a different theory of gravity that does a better job of explaining how things work. Well, even that breaks down on a subatomic level. If you get close to the Planck length or something like that, then general relativity doesn't work quite as well there, and you need a quantum theory of gravity. So these moral systems are kind of the same way. These moral systems will give you mostly correct answers most of the time, but we always test them by looking at fringe cases. And if you can find counterexamples, then you can undermine that theory. And one of them is like, let me take utilitarianism, for example. In utilitarianism, you're supposed to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. There are variations in utilitarianism, but that's one of the principles that one version of utilitarianism uses. And the way people try to undermine this is coming up with scenarios in which the greatest thing to do for the greatest number of people turns out to be an immoral thing, like killing a man. If murdering somebody produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people, then according to this principle, you would be morally obligated to murder this person. But obviously, murder is wrong. So rather than getting rid of the person, you'd get rid of the theory, or either that, or you have to tweak the theory to make it to where you don't get that unwanted result or whatever. So think about that. Why is it that we don't just get rid of the man instead of get rid of the moral theory? Well, the reason is because the reason we know that it's wrong to kill a man isn't because of the moral theory. It's because of our moral intuitions. We're basically judging all these moral theories based on our moral intuitions of what we already know is right or wrong. There are clear case examples of moral wrongs and moral rights that we use to judge these moral theories, which means that we're not getting our morality from these theories. These theories are basically just thumb rules, just general guidelines to help us make moral decisions. But ultimately, we get our morals from our intuitions and reasoning from our moral intuitions. We have certain moral principles and we apply them to situations. Another one that comes up a lot is that morality is just the result of evolution. And it can be biological evolution in the case of morality that's written on the mind, or it can be social evolution. We just kind of evolved in such a way that we can get along with each other. That may be true, but that doesn't show that there's no objective moral truth. You can't look at what caused a belief in order to determine whether the belief is true or not. That's the genetic fallacy. It could be that, for all we know, that God engineered evolution in such a way as to create us to have minds that have moral knowledge. Morality could exist even if we didn't necessarily know about it. It's an interesting objection, because in light of a video I made before about whether or not it's rational to affirm naturalism, because in there I argue that if a belief is caused, if you can point to a cause of a belief in lieu of a reason for a belief, then that undermines rational justification for that belief. And that's kind of what this argument from evolution is saying. It's saying that, well, our belief in morality was caused by the blind processes of evolution, and therefore we have no justification for believing it. Well, if you subscribe to that reason, then go back to naturalism. That's going to affirm one of the premises of my argument against naturalism. So there's that. But again, whether beliefs being caused is any reason to doubt the deliverances of reason, then that really depends on whether it was programmed in a way to make it a reliable belief-producing cognitive faculty. So, for example, if God designed our minds to be reliable belief-producing cognitive faculties, that would be a reason for us to affirm the deliverances of reason. It turns out that evolution not only resulted us in having minds that perceive a difference between right and wrong, but pretty much everything else that sits at the foundation of our knowledge was produced the same way. Our belief that in other minds, the uniformity of nature, that our senses are giving us true information about the world, all that stuff is the result of evolution. So if the fact that our beliefs were arrived at through evolution undermines our belief in morality, well, it would undermine our belief in pretty much everything else too, because we have nothing but our brains with which to do our believing. And so if our brains are not reliable belief-producing cognitive faculties, then we can't be rational in believing anything at all. So this argument against evolution, or argument against morality from evolution, proves too much, basically. Another one is that some people think that morality is just based on our emotions. So to say that something is wrong is just to say that you don't like it or something like that. I don't think that they are the same thing. For one thing, you can think something is wrong and not get emotional about it at all. I mean, just think, if your own child was murdered, you would obviously feel a lot more strongly about that than you would if somebody else's child on the other side of the world was murdered. You may not feel any emotions about that, but you recognize through your intuition that both are equally wrong. And so morality and emotion are not the same. Now, they're often correlated. We sometimes do get emotional about moral wrongs, but it's not necessarily clear which one is the cause and the effect. Do we think something is wrong because we're emotional about it? Or are we emotional about it because we think it's wrong? That's not clear to me. And so another thing is that there's no correlation between the strength of the emotion and the egregiousness of the moral crime. And you know, again, that can be shown by looking at, like, when somebody does something to wrong you, you're going to be a lot more emotional than if they do something to wrong somebody else. But that doesn't cause you to think it's worse to do something to you than it is to do something to somebody else. And so moral intuitions are not the same thing as emotions. And that brings us to the end of this video. I'm sure there are other objections and stuff. Those are the only ones I could think of at the moment. But yeah, there you have it. Thanks for coming.